The most insidious threat to human civilization does not wear the face of malevolence or cruelty. It masquerades as normalcy, acceptance, and collective wisdom. This threat transforms intelligent individuals into willing participants in their own mental enslavement, not through force or coercion, but through a phenomenon so subtle that its victims often believe themselves to be enlightened. This invisible enemy operates through what appears to be ordinary social behavior, yet it possesses the power to turn brilliant minds into instruments of destruction. During the darkest period of human history, when Nazi ideology consumed an entire nation, Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed something that disturbed him more deeply than the obvious brutality surrounding him. He witnessed neighbors, colleagues, and respected community leaders becoming complicit in unthinkable acts. These were not inherently evil people driven by malicious intent. They were ordinary citizens who had surrendered their capacity for independent thought. They had become functionally stupid, and this stupidity had transformed them into agents of a system they barely understood. Bonhoeffer recognized that this was not the familiar stupidity of limited intellectual capacity or educational deficiency. This was something far more dangerous. A collective form of mental paralysis. It spreads through societies like a contagion. It does not target the mind directly, but rather attacks the will to think independently. Once this faculty is compromised, even the most educated and well-intentioned individuals become susceptible to manipulation and can be convinced to participate in actions that contradict their fundamental values. The theologian documented how professors defended ideological doctrines they had never seriously examined, how physicians participated in medical experiments that violated every principle of their training, and how ordinary citizens reported their neighbors to authorities based on nothing more than suspicion and social pressure. These individuals were not monsters in human form, but rather decent people who had ceased to function as autonomous moral agents. They had become extensions of a larger system, thinking its thoughts and executing its will while maintaining the illusion of personal agency. The traditional conception of stupidity focuses on individual cognitive limitations. We imagine someone with obvious intellectual deficits, someone easily identified and perhaps pitied. This comfortable stereotype obscures the reality of functional stupidity, which operates at a systemic level. It inhabits institutions, educational frameworks, cultural norms, and social expectations. This form of stupidity does not announce itself through obvious ignorance, but rather through the absence of critical questioning. When stupidity becomes institutionalized, it transforms from a personal failing into a sociological force. It creates environments where thinking is discouraged, where questioning authority is viewed as disruptive, and where conformity is celebrated as virtue. People stop engaging in genuine reflection, not because they lack the ability, but because the social structure has made thinking unnecessary. The system provides ready-made answers, predetermined responses, and acceptable opinions for every situation. This systematic approach to intellectual pacification serves powerful interests. Critical thinkers pose challenges to established order. They question policies, examine motivations, and refuse to accept explanations at face value. Such individuals slow down efficient operation of social machinery. They demand evidence, seek alternative perspectives, and resist pressure to reach premature conclusions. Therefore, creating citizens who consume information passively, who react predictably to stimuli, and who mistake having opinions for genuine thought becomes a strategic imperative for those who benefit from maintaining existing power structures. The result is a population that believes itself to be informed and engaged while actually performing predetermined roles in a script they did not write. These individuals feel autonomous while following invisible guidelines that shape their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. They participate in democratic processes while being systematically insulated from the kind of deep analysis that would enable them to make truly informed decisions. They consume vast quantities of information while remaining fundamentally ignorant of the forces shaping their worldview. Modern society has perfected mechanisms for promoting this functional stupidity while maintaining the illusion of intellectual freedom. Educational systems emphasize memorization and standardized responses over critical analysis. Students learn to identify correct answers rather than to formulate meaningful questions. They master test-taking strategies while remaining unable to evaluate the validity of the information they have memorized. This approach produces graduates who excel at navigating institutional requirements but lack the intellectual tools necessary for independent analysis of complex issues. Media outlets present complex issues through oversimplified narratives that discourage deeper investigation. News stories are crafted to fit predetermined formats that prioritize emotional impact over analytical depth. Journalists who attempt nuanced coverage of controversial topics face pressure from editors, advertisers, and audiences who prefer clear heroes and villains to ambiguous realities. The result is a media landscape that informs people about events while simultaneously preventing them from understanding the underlying dynamics that create those events. Social media platforms create echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs while filtering out challenging perspectives. These technological systems exploit fundamental features of human psychology to maximize user engagement and advertising revenue. They present users with content specifically designed to confirm their preconceptions and inflame their emotions. People spend hours consuming information that feels diverse and comprehensive, while actually being exposed to an increasingly narrow range of perspectives that align with their existing biases. Entertainment culture promotes instant gratification over sustained contemplation. The rapid pace of modern media consumption habits makes deep thinking seem boring and irrelevant. People become accustomed to having their attention captured and directed by external stimuli rather than developing the capacity for self-directed thought. They lose the ability to tolerate ambiguity, uncertainty, and the temporary discomfort that accompanies genuine intellectual growth. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer found himself imprisoned by the Nazi regime in 1943, he used his time to analyze the psychological and social dynamics that had enabled such a catastrophic transformation of German society. His observations led him to conclude that stupidity, not evil, represented the gravest threat to human dignity and freedom. He witnessed educated professionals, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens becoming instruments of oppression, not through deliberate malice, but through the abdication of personal judgment. Bonhoeffer observed that these individuals had externalized their moral compass, allowing external authorities to determine right from wrong on their behalf. They followed orders, repeated slogans, and participated in increasingly extreme actions because they had ceased to evaluate their behavior according to internal ethical standards. The regime had succeeded in creating a population that felt righteous while perpetrating atrocities, because they had surrendered the responsibility of moral reasoning to institutional authority. The theologian recognized that this surrender was not forced upon people against their will. Rather, individuals actively chose to relinquish their autonomy in exchange for the comfort of belonging, the security of acceptance, and the convenience of not having to struggle with difficult questions. They traded intellectual independence for social validation and found relief in having their decisions made for them by others who claimed superior knowledge or authority. This choice appeared rational from the perspective of individual psychology. Independent thinking requires sustained effort, creates social tension, and often leads to uncomfortable conclusions that challenge cherished beliefs. It demands intellectual honesty that may reveal personal limitations or moral failures. It requires the courage to stand alone when necessary, and the humility to admit uncertainty about important issues. In contrast, conformity offers immediate rewards, social approval, reduced anxiety, and the satisfaction of feeling aligned with righteous causes. Bonhoeffer concluded that stupidity in this context was not a cognitive deficiency, but an ethical choice. It represented a fundamental decision to prioritize comfort and conformity over the sometimes painful process of independent moral reasoning. This choice, once made, created individuals who were not merely passive victims of propaganda, but active participants in their own intellectual subjugation. They became enthusiastic defenders of systems they did not understand and aggressive opponents of ideas they had never seriously considered. Contemporary psychological research has validated many of Bonhoeffer's intuitive insights about human behavior under social pressure. The Dunning-Kruger effect demonstrates that individuals with limited knowledge or competence in a particular area tend to overestimate their expertise. This cognitive bias creates conditions where the least qualified people speak with the greatest confidence, while those with genuine understanding recognize the complexity of issues and express appropriate uncertainty. The result is public discourse dominated by oversimplified explanations delivered with unwarranted certainty. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments revealed the extent to which social pressure influences individual judgment. When faced with obviously incorrect group consensus, a significant percentage of participants abandoned their own perceptions to align with the majority opinion. These studies showed that the fear of social rejection often overrides commitment to truth, creating environments where collective delusions can flourish unchallenged. Participants in these experiments often reported feeling confused and distressed by the contradiction between their perceptions and group consensus. Yet they chose social harmony over personal integrity. Modern neuroscience has identified biological mechanisms that make independent thinking genuinely difficult. When individuals encounter information that challenges their established beliefs, their brains activate pain centers similar to those triggered by physical injury. This neurological response creates a powerful incentive to avoid cognitive dissonance. By either rejecting challenging information or rationalizing it away rather than engaging in the demanding process of belief revision. The human brain appears to be wired to resist the kind of intellectual flexibility that independent thinking requires. Confirmation bias further compounds these challenges by creating systematic filters that allow individuals to encounter primarily information that reinforces their existing worldview. People unconsciously seek sources that tell them what they already believe while avoiding those that might challenge their preconceptions. Digital algorithms exploit this tendency by creating personalized information environments that feel comprehensive, while actually limiting exposure to diverse perspectives. People can spend enormous amounts of time consuming information, while remaining fundamentally uninformed about alternative viewpoints or contrary evidence. Stanley Milgram, as obedience experiments demonstrated how ordinary individuals could be induced to inflict harm on others when directed by legitimate authority figures. Participants in these studies experienced obvious distress while administering what they believed were dangerous electric shocks. Yet the majority continued to follow instructions. These experiments revealed how external authority can override personal moral judgment, creating conditions where people act against their own values while maintaining a sense of righteousness. The participants in Milgram's experiments were not sadistic individuals who enjoyed causing pain. They were ordinary people who had been placed in situations where they felt compelled to surrender their moral agency to an external authority. When questioned afterward, many expressed regret and confusion about their behavior, yet they had been unable to resist the pressure to obey in the moment. This dynamic illustrates how systems can be designed to exploit human psychology in ways that make resistance extremely difficult, even for well-intentioned people. The contemporary information landscape has created unprecedented opportunities for the manipulation of public consciousness. Social media algorithms prioritize content that generates emotional engagement, particularly anger, fear, and moral outrage. These emotional states inhibit analytical thinking and promote reactive behavior. Users believe they are accessing diverse information, while actually being fed curated content designed to maintain their attention and influence their behavior. These technological systems have created what might be called industrialized stupidity, the mass production of intellectual conformity through sophisticated manipulation of human psychology. Unlike traditional propaganda, which relied on crude appeals and obvious manipulation, contemporary influence operations exploit subtle features of information presentation, social dynamics, and cognitive biases to shape behavior without creating awareness of manipulation. People feel free while being systematically guided toward predetermined conclusions. Educational systems that emphasize standardized testing and predetermined correct answers inadvertently discourage the kind of open-ended inquiry that develops critical thinking skills. Students learn to identify approved responses rather than to question assumptions, examine evidence, or consider alternative interpretations. This approach produces graduates who are highly skilled at navigating institutional requirements while lacking the intellectual tools necessary for independent analysis. They can recite information, but struggle to evaluate its validity or relevance. The emphasis on measurable outcomes in education has led to curricula that prioritize facts that can be tested over skills that are difficult to quantify. Students learn to optimize their performance on assessments rather than to develop genuine understanding of complex subjects. They become expert at identifying what teachers and test makers want to hear while remaining unable to formulate their own questions or pursue independent lines of inquiry. Political discourse has been deliberately simplified into competing sets of tribal loyalties that discourage substantive policy analysis. Complex issues are reduced to emotional appeals and identity markers that allow individuals to choose sides without understanding the underlying questions. This process transforms political participation from civic engagement into psychological identification, making citizens more susceptible to manipulation while feeling more politically involved. Politicians and media figures have learned to exploit this dynamic by crafting messages that trigger tribal responses rather than encouraging thoughtful analysis. They present policy debates as battles between good and evil, rather than as complex problems requiring careful consideration of trade-offs and unintended consequences. Citizens are encouraged to express strong opinions about issues they do not understand and to treat political disagreement as personal attack rather than intellectual difference. Entertainment culture promotes instant gratification and emotional stimulation over sustained intellectual engagement. The rapid pace of modern media consumption habits makes deep contemplation seem boring and irrelevant. People become accustomed to having their attention captured and directed by external stimuli rather than developing the capacity for self-directed thought. They lose the patience required for reading lengthy texts, following complex arguments, or sitting quietly with difficult questions. The entertainment industry has discovered that audiences respond more strongly to familiar formulas than to genuinely original content. This creates economic incentives to produce material that confirms existing expectations rather than challenging audiences to think in new ways. The result is a cultural environment that systematically reinforces intellectual passivity while providing the illusion of variety and choice. The combination of these factors creates what might be called a stupidity industrial complex, a network of institutions, technologies, and cultural practices that systematically discourage independent thinking while maintaining the appearance of intellectual freedom. This system does not require conspiracy or central coordination. It emerges naturally from the intersection of technological capabilities, economic incentives, and psychological vulnerabilities. Individual actors within this system may have no intention of promoting stupidity. Educators want their students to succeed. Journalists want to inform the public. Entertainers want to provide enjoyment, and technology developers want to create useful products. Yet the collective effect of their efforts, operating within current institutional and economic constraints, tends to discourage the kind of independent thinking that democracy and human flourishing require. Resisting this systematic assault on independent thought requires recognizing that thinking is not a passive activity, but an active practice that must be consciously cultivated. Genuine thinking involves questioning assumptions, tolerating uncertainty, and accepting the discomfort that comes with examining cherished beliefs. It demands patience, humility, and the courage to stand apart from social consensus when necessary. The practice of independent thought has always been demanding, but contemporary conditions have made it particularly challenging. Social media creates pressure for immediate responses to complex issues, discouraging the reflection necessary for thoughtful analysis. The overwhelming volume of available information can create paralysis rather than insight. The polarization of public discourse makes nuanced positions seem like fence-sitting or intellectual cowardice. Developing intellectual independence requires creating deliberate practices that counteract these pressures. This might involve setting aside regular time for reflection, seeking out perspectives that challenge comfortable assumptions, and cultivating relationships with people who think differently. It means accepting that being truly informed requires acknowledging the limits of one's knowledge and remaining open to changing one's mind when presented with compelling evidence. The stakes of this struggle extend beyond personal intellectual satisfaction. Democracies depend on citizens who can think critically about complex issues, evaluate competing claims, and make informed decisions. Free markets function best when consumers can assess products and services intelligently. Scientific progress requires researchers who can question established theories and consider alternative explanations. Cultural vitality emerges from individuals who can imagine new possibilities rather than simply reproducing existing patterns. When significant portions of the population abandon independent thought, they become vulnerable to demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems. They may support policies that contradict their own interests because they lack the analytical tools necessary to evaluate political rhetoric critically. They may make personal decisions based on advertising and social pressure rather than careful consideration of their actual needs and values. The responsibility for maintaining intellectual independence cannot be delegated to institutions or authorities. Educational systems, media organizations, and political leaders all have roles to play in creating conditions that support critical thinking. But ultimately, each individual must choose whether to engage in the demanding work of independent analysis or to accept the easier path of intellectual conformity. This choice becomes more difficult as the benefits of conformity become more obvious and the costs of independent thinking increase. Social media algorithms reward content that aligns with popular sentiment while suppressing messages that challenge prevailing orthodoxies. Career advancement often depends on demonstrating appropriate attitudes rather than analytical capability. Social relationships may suffer when individuals express unconventional views or refuse to participate in collective enthusiasms. Yet the alternative to accepting these costs is to surrender the essential human capacity for autonomous moral reasoning. When people stop thinking for themselves, they become instruments in the hands of others who may not share their values or interests. They lose the ability to recognize when they are being manipulated and may even defend their manipulators against those who attempt to point out the deception. Bonhoeffer's analysis suggests that stupidity is ultimately a moral choice rather than an intellectual limitation. People become stupid not because they lack intelligence, but because they choose comfort over truth, belonging over integrity, and security over freedom. This choice, while understandable given human psychology and social pressures, represents an abdication of moral responsibility that enables the worst forms of human behavior. The contemporary relevance of Bonhoeffer's insights cannot be overstated. We live in an era where technological tools for mass manipulation have become incredibly sophisticated, while educational and cultural institutions have weakened in their capacity to develop critical thinking skills. The combination creates conditions where entire populations can be induced to support policies and leaders that contradict their own stated values and interests. Recognizing the reality of functional stupidity and its role in contemporary society represents the first step toward resistance. The second step involves accepting personal responsibility for maintaining intellectual independence despite the social and psychological costs. The third step requires developing practices and relationships that support continued growth in analytical capability and moral reasoning. This is not a call to intellectual arrogance or social isolation. Genuine thinking involves recognizing the limits of individual knowledge and remaining open to learning from others. It means distinguishing between legitimate expertise and mere authority, between evidence-based reasoning and ideological positioning. It requires developing the humility to admit uncertainty while maintaining the courage to act on carefully considered convictions. The future of human freedom may well depend on whether enough individuals choose to accept the challenges and costs of independent thinking. The alternative is a world where sophisticated forms of manipulation shape human behavior on a massive scale, where people believe themselves free while actually serving interests they do not understand, and where the capacity for autonomous moral reasoning gradually disappears from human civilization. Dietrich Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for his commitment to thinking independently and acting on his convictions. His example reminds us that intellectual and moral courage often come with significant costs, but that the alternative to paying these costs is the loss of everything that makes human existence meaningful and dignified. The choice between thinking and not thinking remains as relevant today as it was in his prison cell, and the consequences of that choice continue to shape the trajectory of human civilization.